What's more dangerous, a species that fights back, or a species that simply refuses to notice it's supposed to be losing? The Khorvath built their evaluation to teach every civilization its proper place in a vast, indifferent universe. It had never failed to teach that lesson. Not once, in 11,000 years. No one warned the examiner that humanity had never been given the luxury of learning it in the first place. By the time he understood what that meant, the test was already unraveling around him. There is a station in the quiet dark between three galactic arms that most civilizations only ever hear about in warning stories told to frightened younglings. It belongs to the Khorvath Evaluation Authority, an institution so old that its founding predates written language on most member worlds, and its purpose is simple: to determine, once and for all, whether a species is fit to sit at the galaxy's table. For 11,000 years, the authority's test has never been passed in the way it was designed to be passed. It has been survived occasionally, endured rarely. But never passed, never walked away from with a smile, a shrug, and a request for the nearest coffee vendor, until the day a species called humanity signed up for evaluation. Sat down in the waiting room, and asked if the vending machine took Earth currency. This is the story of that day. And if you've ever wondered what happens when an ancient, self-important institution meets a species that simply refuses to be impressed by the end of the world, stick around because you're about to find out. If this is your first time here, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read everyone. The Khorvath station hung in space like a cathedral built by mathematicians who had never once been told that's enough. Stop now, black, angular, endlessly reflective, the kind of architecture designed less to house an evaluation and more to make you doubt you deserved to be. Evaluated at all, the Khorvath themselves were tall, thin-limbed beings with 4 pale eyes and a language that translated, roughly, into a permanent tone of weary disappointment. They had tested over 400 species across 11 millennia, and in that time, they had built the single largest archive of civilizational failure in the known galaxy. The Vren ascendancy had required 2 centuries of collective therapy after their attempt. The silicate choir of Barrows had gone completely silent, by choice, for 400 years. And the Hawkran Dominion, once the most feared warrior culture in 3 sectors, had emerged from their evaluation and unanimously voted to take up competitive pottery instead. The test facility's chief examiner, a Khorvath elder whose name translated approximately to "he who measures the depth of your inadequacy," had personally overseen every one of those 400 failures. He took a quiet, dignified pride in it. Not cruelty, just certainty. The universe was vast, indifferent, and mathematically hostile to anyone who hadn't yet learned their proper place in it. That was the lesson the test existed to teach. Nobody had ever told humanity that lesson. As it turned out, nobody ever would. The human delegate arrived alone, which the examiner noted with some surprise. Most species sent their finest, their generals, their philosophers, their most decorated minds. Humanity sent a maintenance engineer named Sam Okafor, who had volunteered for the assignment mostly because it came with hazard pay, and he needed to fix the plumbing in his apartment. He was of unremarkable height, carried a battered metal thermos that smelled faintly of scorched bitterness, and wore the expression of a man who had shown up for a mildly inconvenient Tuesday, not the most feared evaluation in galactic history. Representative of the human species, the examiner intoned, his translated voice carrying the gravity of a funeral bell. You stand before the most exhaustive test of species worthiness ever devised. Sam looked around at the black, watching walls, the corridors that folded in ways that made his eyes ache, and the faint humming that seemed engineered to make a person question the point of getting out of bed in the morning. Nice place, he said. Bit much on the lighting, though. You guys ever consider a window? The examiner's 4 eyes blinked in a pattern his species reserved for genuine confusion. In 11,000 years, no delegate had ever critiqued the interior design. Quick question for you: if you walked into a room built specifically to make you feel small and insignificant, would you play along? Or would you just start making small talk about the lighting? Let me know in the comments. The first trial materialized without warning. A crushing ocean environment, Pressure enough to fold most biological structures into paste. Water simultaneously scalding and freezing, chemically hostile enough to unravel molecular bonds on contact. The aquatic Thessene Concorde, tested 3 centuries prior, had lasted 11 seconds in that same environment before their entire delegation began speaking in tongues and renouncing the sea itself. Sam took a sip from his thermos, looked around at the crushing black water, and exhaled. He said. Reminds me of my one and only scuba trip off the coast of Ireland. Water was colder than this, if I'm honest. The pressure alone should be liquefying your skeletal structure, the examiner said, his composure fraying at the edges. Yeah, it's got some bite to it, Sam agreed, wading forward as though he were crossing a shallow creek. You should try our oceans during a proper storm. This is a Tuesday afternoon by comparison. The examiner's instruments insisted the environment was functioning exactly as designed, lethal, absolute, inescapable. The human was simply declining to acknowledge that fact, the way a person might decline to acknowledge a persistent but ultimately harmless mosquito. Desperate, the examiner escalated to the second trial, a psychological landscape built to unravel rational thought itself. Cause and effect became optional. Memory turned unreliable. Every certainty a mind had ever held was revealed, one by one, to be statistically meaningless in an indifferent universe. The hyperlogical Satari assembly had lobotomized themselves rather than complete this trial. The warrior monks of the Thessene Concorde had disbanded their entire civilization and taken up competitive silence. Sam floated in the void of shifting, whispering nothingness, listened for exactly the length of time it took to finish his coffee and said, "This is honestly kind of nice. Like one of those white noise apps, except instead of ocean sounds, it's the universe having a minor identity crisis. Very relaxing." You are experiencing complete philosophical dissolution, the examiner said, voice fraying further. The foundations of coherent thought are being systematically dismantled. Did that Tuesday before last, Sam said mildly. Turns out, nothing makes a whole lot of sense if you look at it too hard. Once you accept that, the rest gets a lot easier. You lot seem to have gotten stuck somewhere in the middle of that realization. Here's a bigger question. Do you think humanity's calm in the face of the impossible comes from bravery, or from just being genuinely used to chaos? I want to hear your theory before the story wraps up. The examiner, now operating on something closer to institutional panic than professional confidence, triggered the third and final trial, the infinite combat array. An endless procession of opponents engineered to demonstrate the total futility of violence as a solution to anything. The militant Drax's hegemony had been reduced after this trial to pacifists who refused to participate in anything more aggressive than competitive gardening. Sam faced down a geometric horror that existed in 11 dimensions at once, a sentient collapsed star with strong opinions about the ethics of warfare. And by the 15th opponent, something that could only be described as the physical embodiment of inevitable defeat. Okay, now this is actually fun, Sam said, sidestepping a beam of concentrated despair with the easy confidence of a man who had grown up dodging much worse on much smaller budgets. Your enemy, AI, is a bit predictable, though. And can I ask, why does everything keep trying to convince me violence is pointless? I already know that, doesn't mean it's never necessary. He kept going, methodically, almost cheerfully. Not because he was extraordinary in strength or genius in strategy, but because the entire trial was built on an assumption the Corvath had never questioned in 11,000 years. That any sufficiently advanced horror would eventually break a species' will to keep standing back up. Humanity had never had the luxury of a will that stayed broken. Not for very long. Not ever, really. Wave 43 already, Sam noted, dispatching a mechanical entity that fired philosophical arguments instead of bullets. This is basically an old arcade game with better graphics and worse jokes. You guys have a high scoreboard? This is mathematically impossible, the examiner finally said, all pretense of clinical detachment gone. No species has ever progressed past the 20th wave. The system was designed to generate opponents indefinitely, until the subject reaches total psychological collapse. Cool, Sam said, sipping the last of his coffee. So it's an endurance thing. I can work with that. The examiner stared at this ordinary, unremarkable man, a plumber by trade, a species representative by accident, and felt, for the first time in 11,000 years, something the Korvath language had no clean word for. Something close to doubt. "You don't understand," the examiner said, and for the first time his voice cracked with something almost desperate. "This test exists to show every species its proper place in the order of things. To prove that the universe is vast and cruel and utterly indifferent to ambition." Sam paused mid-motion, genuinely curious now. "Why would you want to prove that? Sounds like a pretty miserable thing to build an entire institution around." "Where I'm from, we tell our kids the opposite, that the universe doesn't care about you." "Sure, but that just means you get to decide what matters instead of waiting for it to tell you." And that, not the trial, not the combat, not the ocean or the void, was the moment the Korvath Evaluation Authority's 11,000-year certainty quietly, finally, broke. Here is the part the authority never recorded in their official archive, though every Korvath present that day remembers it clearly. Sam Okafor did not pass the test. Not in any sense the Korvath understood. Their instruments never once registered a species overcoming the trials, because Sam hadn't overcome them. He had simply never been told they were supposed to be impossible. Humanity had sent a plumber, not a soldier or a scholar, precisely because no one on Earth had believed the Korvath test would matter one way or another. It was optional, low stakes, a curiosity, slotted in between a plumbing job and picking up groceries. The authority had spent 11,000 years building the single most feared evaluation in the galaxy, and humanity had simply forgotten to be afraid of it. The examiner would later request, in his final report, that the authority permanently retire the evaluation. Not because it had been beaten, the Korvath insisted, for the sake of their own dignity. That it technically had not, but because they could no longer bring themselves to administer a test whose entire philosophical foundation had been casually dismantled by a man checking his watch and worrying about groceries. "So," Sam said, finishing the last combat wave and glancing at a battered wristwatch, "is there a final boss or is that it? Only I promised my wife I'd grab milk on the way home and you would not believe how she gets about forgotten groceries." The examiner sat in silence for a long moment before asking the only question that mattered anymore. "How? How does your species endure what has broken civilizations far older, far wiser than yours?" Sam shrugged, the universal gesture of a species that had learned to shrug at nearly everything. "Honestly, Earth's rough. Weather tries to kill you, wildlife tries to eat you. And we spend most of our history making things harder for each other on top of that. You get used to hard. Doesn't mean you stop finding the good parts. This test felt a lot like our horror movies, if I'm honest. Yours just had a worse gift shop." The Korvath Evaluation Authority never fully recovered its old certainty. Word spread, slowly, and then all at once, across the sectors that had once feared the test above all things, that the institution built to remind every species of its smallness had been met, calmly, by a man with a thermos of burnt coffee, who simply hadn't gotten the memo that he was supposed to be afraid. They redesigned the test eventually. It never carried quite the same weight again. It's difficult to maintain 11,000 years of cosmic authority once you've been quietly, cheerfully out-philosophized by someone whose greatest concern that day was whether the store still had the brand of milk his wife liked. The galaxy, it turned out, had spent eons building elaborate monuments to its own bleak certainty. It just took one very ordinary human with a very ordinary thermos to point out that certainty was never really the point. And for the first time, the galaxy understood not what humanity could conquer. What humanity could simply, stubbornly refuse to be afraid of. If this story moved you, subscribe for more human stories from the stars.